Welcome to Ames Public Library for tonight's event with the authors of Shattering the Glass, A Remarkable History of Women's Basketball. This program is brought to you through partnership with Ames Public Library, the Iowa Department of Natural Resources, Ames History Museum, Iowa Center for the Book, and Beaverdale Books. I'm Megan. I'm the Adult Services Manager here at the library. The library's mission is to connect you to the world of ideas, which we do through offering a broad variety of resources and programs like tonight's event. We invite you to join us for future programs, which you can learn more about through our current issue of Page 1 or by signing up for our events email. For those of you joining us online, we'll be muting your microphones during the presentation, so please submit any questions you might have via the chat function. Today's session is being recorded and will be posted to the Ames Public Library YouTube channel after the program ends. If you get bumped out of today's event, please follow that original link back and you'll get right back in. If you're with us in person, Beaverdale Books is on site and has books to sell before and after the event, and our authors will be available for signings after the event as well. So at this point, I will pass it over to Savannah Johnson from the Ames History Museum.
Is this okay? Like Megan mentioned, my name is Savannah Johnson. I'm the Visitor Services Manager with the Ames History Museum. Located at 416 Douglas, the mission of the Ames History Museum is to engage our diverse public and provide unique opportunities to learn about Ames history through some great partnerships like tonight's event. I won't take up too much of your time because you will be hearing more from me later this evening, but without further ado, I'd like to welcome up John Wenk from the DNR to help introduce our speakers this evening.
Good evening, everyone. My name is John Lake. I'm with the Iowa DNR. I'm the Water Trails Coordinator. Is that you or me?
Nope.
Okay. Oh, it's out there. But the Skunk River, as many of you probably are aware of, is a state water trail, and there's a great group of Skunk River paddlers that go out routinely and maintain areas and remove trees from remove down trees and whatnot. So I'm grateful to them. But we're here today to actually learn and listen about women's basketball. And I have to say that by now I've become friends with Pamela and Susan over there. I have to tell a little bit about my story, and this, I think partly why they're here today is about a little over a year ago, I got struck with that Caitlin Clark fever, as many people have. I'm not a sports person. I mean, I don't even watch men's sports usually. I mean, I might watch the Super Bowl on occasion or the World Series, the big ones, And, but Caitlin Clark was like a comet. And she really was bright. And I'm like, I can't figure what is going on here. Everyone's going crazy. And I started watching her play, and that was it, and I was hooked. And then I started wondering, because I love history, I was like, how did this all come to be? And I got on Google and I was like, best book on women's basketball. Their book kept coming up. And a year ago, I bought the first edition and I read through it. And as soon as I get the second chapter, and I'm not going to go into it, but there's a story about small town Correctionville. And it just pulled me in. And from then, I was just sold. And I mean, I read it. If a nonfiction can be riveting, this book is riveting. And I was just like incredibly entranced. And I even saw them out on LinkedIn, and I was like, I read your book. Man, this is great. My wife and I have season tickets to the Lynx now, and they're in the playoffs, they're in the semifinals, and we made 2 trips up there and back, just in 2 days. But anyway, that's the power, I think, of the sport. When the thing to me that was so admirable or so cool was, well, not cool, but learning how much women had to go through to get to where they're at today. And this book does a great job of really helping me understand. And besides that, if you could go to the index and you look at Iowa, it has the most entries than any other thing in the index. So Iowa plays a huge role in the history of women's basketball. It just made me even more proud to be from the state. So without any further ado, I'm just going to introduce Pamela Grundy and Susan Shackelford.
All right, but turn that on and say we're so excited to be here in Iowa. This book was just a joy to write, because it's a book about women loving sports and finding all sorts of ways to be able to play it, even when it's not encouraged, and just the joy of movement and play and competition, generation after generation after generation, just going to talk to these women or reading. It's just so much fun. So we have really enjoyed doing that.
Absolutely. The way this book came to be originally, we had a first edition in 2005, and I moved in across the street from Pamela, and it was just a coincidence. We barely knew each other, barely. And then we got to be friends, neighbors, friends. And one day, Pamela says, I've been wanting to write a history of women's basketball. There needs to be a book. And I don't want to do it by myself. I've been asking other people, when they do it, then they can just do the whole thing. But nobody is taking me up on it. So she said, it came to me, maybe we could write it together.
Yeah, because I knew the history. I'm a historian. I knew the history. Susan is more journalist. Plus, she's a rabid basketball fan, and so it just seemed like I knew the past. She knew the present, and we could do it together. And we did. It was totally fun.
It was. Yeah, I was so excited that day as we stood there. I told her, I said, when I'm this excited, I don't make a decision. If I can wait a little bit, because I know the size of this commitment. We both had lives that were very active. I had a whole writing business and editing business, and I was going to have to make room for this. And she was going to have to make room with all that she did.
I had a little boy.
That's true. That's a good thing.
And a husband.
So, yeah, and I have a wife, family. So, anyway, boy, early the next day. Yeah, let's do it. That's it. So it was fun.
And then we were saying, okay, it came out in 2005, and that was the point where we were thinking women's basketball was just going to take off. Because there'd been the 96 Olympics, the WNBA started, they had two women's leagues for a while, and so we're like, okay, we're going to catch this wave, except that it really plateaued out, and that didn't happen. And so, still great stories and all. But then a few years ago, it just seemed like things were building up again. And a lot of stuff had gone on since it first came out. So we're like, we need to do another edition. And we had it all planned, and we were, we were pretty close to the end, and then all of a sudden, Caitlin Clark. And we're like, well, we don't connect this, but it was, just the excitement with that, with all the players, with South Carolina, with UConn, it just really picked up. So that was really exciting. But as John said, Iowa just runs through the whole history of women's basketball, more so really than any other place. So we're very excited to be able to be here and talk. So what we're going to do, we're just going to go real quickly through a broad brush of the history of women's basketball, using Iowa as an example, because there's Iowa stuff everywhere. And then we'll do some Q&A, and we'll talk about things. We have at least one expert in Iowa basketball that's much more of an expert than we are, so we can get some corrections if need be. But so to start, the first thing that I didn't get prepared for this is I went and I looked at some of the what was then Iowa State College yearbooks, because those old yearbooks were so much fun, particularly when you're looking at women's sports. The men don't necessarily look all that different, but the women, it's really transformative. And so if you look here, this is from 1910, and they're talking about the Women's Athletic Club that was started, they said, in 1907 with tennis and field hockey and basketball. And they've very cleverly done that Iowa State College logo and worked it into each of those teams. But that's really the beginning. And it's interesting that 1910 is the first year that men play basketball in Iowa. Before that, that's the first time you see a men's basketball team, because often basketball was seen as a women's game. It was sissy game, men thought, because you couldn't die like football. I mean, it was a much rougher game, and so it was for quite a lot of women's game, which is itself interesting. This is the 1903 Iowa State College team. They look like they're getting ready to get out on the court. They first, actually, the first in the yearbooks that I came across was actually 1898. Was the first time that there was a picture of a women's basketball team. So that was very soon. Basketball was invented at the beginning of 1891. Senator Berenson repurposes it for women 1892, 1893. So it's very soon after that women start playing all over the country. It's this exciting thing for college women. You know, they haven't had a chance to play team sports before. And so it just is all over. And I played as well. Here's a team from Drake. There's a team from Drake. Drake across. This is the Drake varsity, and you can see at this point, this is I think 1905. They're not playing that 3-on-3 yet. They're playing the five persons. So that's going to shift later on. Women's rules have shifted quite often over the years as there have been different ideas about what they're able to do and what they should do. So this is the Drake team. And there actually were a number of intercollegiate games at this time. Coe College had a team and they played Iowa State College. They played Drake. There were a couple of other teams that they played. But then very quickly, as in the rest of the country, the idea was that, well, women really weren't supposed to go out and be too competitive. And so then they played intramural. Freshmen who played sophomores and that kind of thing. So that went on for a long, long time. And one of the people, this is really interesting, I discovered this is Mabel Lee. Mabel Lee from Coe College was one of the great physical educators of her era. She was the first woman to be president of the American Physical Educators Association and helped prepare women in World War II. Physical education, which she went to Coe College. She graduated. She enrolled in 1904. One of the stories is that she saw they had a women's basketball team. She saw a picture, and she wanted to do physical education. So she went. She went there. She did most of her time at the University of Nebraska. She was very famous physical educator there. So you have college. So women are playing a little bit. But when you really get the excitement all over the country is when you get to high school. And this is Correctionville. That first team that I thought John mentioned this, I thought I'd just read you a little taste of what we say about correction, which we're going to go to, which we're very excited about. So in the spring of 1920, the girls' basketball team from Iowa's Correctionville High School boarded an overnight train for Drake University in Des Moines. Since the team could not afford a sleeping car, players napped in their seats. Enthusiasm ran high. In 3 seasons of play, they had compiled a record of 69-0 and won an invitation to Iowa's first ever girls' state high school championship. Now, if Iowans had any doubts about their daughter's strength or stamina, the tournament schedule failed to reflect them. Correctionville played 5 games in 2 days, and the only place to rest was in the dressing room on the wrestling pads on the floor. The team played 3 games on the final day, and 1 went into overtime. Players got a half-hour break between the semifinal and the final. But in the final contest, Correctionville beat the squad from Nevada High School 11-4 and was crowned Iowa's first girls high school champion. I think perhaps the thing I remember most about it was how tired they all were. Team member Ona Mae Wilkie Breckenridge recalled 30 years later. It was fun, though. I'd do it again, and I don't believe any of us suffered any ill effects from it. So that's Iowa. And there are girls playing in high schools all across the country. This is the time of high school, consolidated high school. High schools become something that most Americans start to go to. It's building up. And so you have all sorts of, this is an Indian tournament held in in Rapid City at the school there. These are teams from various boarding schools that came together to play this basketball tournament. In the South, where we're from, there are a lot of black teams. It's really popular with in African American high schools, which obviously in the South are segregated, so it's all black schools. And in fact, black women also play in college. A lot of the historically black colleges have competitive women's teams at a time that a lot of black schools don't. So that's a good thing. But Iowa is special because they really do. They start this women's basketball tournament that becomes a huge deal. And it's very important because they establish an independent girls' high school association. And that means that they can do what they want to do. They don't have to play second fiddle to men's association. And as I'm sure you all know, it just builds up to be this extraordinary thing. We have Ida Grove. We've got, well, that was Newhall. This is Ida Grove, 1928. Iowa also starts to be an important aspect in the AAU. And we'll let Susan talk. She's going to move on to the AAU.
So, you have the high schools that are all over the country. Well, they continue for a while, but the colleges just don't play for the most part. But what did happen were these AAU teams, and they were concentrated in the South and the Midwest. And Iowa had at least three that really were known that we know of. The American Institute of Commerce and the American Institute of Business. And then they actually played each other at one point for the title, with Commerce winning the title. There was also a bottling plant called Dr. Sweat's. I don't know if that's still around or how long that went on, but Des Moines was from Des Moines and was the runner-up. So AAU really provided something, but it was far from universal. And there was a lot of, a lot of girls that would come out of high school, and if you just didn't happen to know about it, you were out of luck. In North Carolina, we had an outstanding AAU team in Haynes Hosiery, and they won titles. And this is Eki Jordan here in the foreground in the white jersey going for the ball. They were based in Winston-Salem. The women had to work in the hosiery mill. Before every game, they were given a free new pair of hose.
Because a lot of times when you do it, there was a little still touchy for women to do this kind of competitive sport. So you would play, but then after you finish playing, you're supposed to look really nice and ladylike. Games could advertise their hose with these, and they recruited from all over the South. I mean, they sought out players to come and play.
They did. They did.
And you might notice who they're playing.
Yeah. I need to point that out. I'm not sure you can see it very well, but
if you look way back, that woman in the Wesleyan.
Yes, Iowa Wesleyan.
That's Iowa Wesleyan.
So there were a handful of colleges that played AAU. This was Wesleyan was one of them. And Wayland Baptist out of Texas was another one, and they were really famous. Their owner of the Wayland, I guess what you call the owner.
Oh no, sure. Wayland was funny. It was a Baptist college.
Yeah.
But then they were in West Texas, and there was a guy who owned airplanes. He had a little airplane company, flew around, and so he started to fly the team around. They were the Wayland Queens, and they became known as the Wayland Flying Queens because they would fly everywhere. But Iowa Wesleyan, and again, I feel like AAU was really the national championship for women. Iowa Wesleyan were the runners-up in 1957 when they lose to Wayland, and also in 1958 when they lose to Nashville Business College, which was another big team. So they were right up there with, again, you see that high school, I think these high school talent coming up into these other Iowa schools, really putting on par with schools around the country or teams around the country.
Absolutely. I'll let you get that next picture. So
the way they're not wearing skirts. And a lot of teams in Iowa were always wearing these shorts.
Yeah. That one, and then it goes back and forth. I mean, that's we can talk about them two forms
yeah,
for hours. Just about all the different things.
we were zoomed in to present it, and we talked a lot about uniforms through the eras of women's basketball, and told them the overall history, and people were engaged.
Yeah, it was just young women that
So, this picture, obviously not basketball, but look closely at it and see if you can see someone that has an Iowa connection, who was a coach at the University of Iowa. Vivian Sprigg, that's her. She's the African American picture. And Vivian really wanted to play basketball at her high school. She was very good. She was like one of the best kids in town in basketball, but no team. So this was the closest she could get. She grew up in Edinburgh, Pennsylvania, and cheerleading was the closest she could get. So she made the squad, and the kids, the boys, respected her so much. And during games, when they were stumped about what to do, they would stop by and ask her. You know, she's there cheering, right?
Watching them.
They would ask her, okay, what do you do in this situation? I mean, I'm sure they had a coach, but they also wanted to get her input. So, and as y'all know, she went on to be such a fabulous college coach. So you know, and a big chunk of the time was at Iowa. So,
and one of the things, I mean, about this is what happened is you had in the 20s and 30s high school girls playing all over the place. I mean, all. But then bit by bit, in state by state, girls basketball gets downplayed. They, particularly physical educators, didn't necessarily think it was good for girls to compete. They didn't necessarily think it was good for boys to compete either, but they didn't do it. They couldn't do anything about that, in this intense way. And so you end up with a lot of states around the country where there is no girls basketball. There's really no, which is what what Vivian Stringer ran into in just all sorts of places, except of course that Iowa State. This is 1961, and this is Virginia Schubert. This is the first. This is the first round of 1961. Ventura and Peking. Anyway, and so they're playing a very different kind of game.
but I can tell you that, you know, I grew up the daughter of a basketball coach, and in the 50s and early 60s was his time. He coached the girls in our hometown as well as these boys who got more attention. Well, one day I said to him, this was years later, I was very tiny when all that was going, and I said, well, how did your girls do during that era? He said, oh, we won the county tournament. I said, oh, that's great. Well, how did they do in the playoffs? Oh, they were in the playoffs. We had no state tournament in North Carolina in the 50s and into the 60s. They had taken it away. There was this overarching concern, as Pam says, by the physical educators, that somehow the women could not hold up to the strains of the sport, even though they've been doing it for decades. I mean, it was just ludicrous. But, you know, the game also did not fit the images of women in our culture that were really being promoted at that time. So, all that kind of flowed together. And so, it was very disheartening into the 60s. But then it started to get a little bit better. Girls really wanted to play, and they would start these little programs within the PE departments as some of the attitudes got a little bit better.
And then some places.
Yes, some places it just got better. Now, this is Christine Grant, and she was the women's athletic director at Iowa. And she was on the physical education staff when I think that she was finishing her PhD at Iowa when Title IX, and was asked, would she do this? Would she run this budding women's athletic program? And she just jumped at it and did an incredible job and was there decades and is just so revered. Sadly we lost her, some years back. Pam and I got to include her in our first edition. She's in the second edition. I did the interview with her, and what a leader she was in the 70s, advocating for women's sport.
And this was national. This was not in Iowa. I mean, she was pretty much the leading advocate, or one of the leading advocates in the entire country for women's basketball, forming the AIAW, the initial organization for women's basketball. So her influence was way beyond Iowa. And it's also,
I wanted to add just one thing on that. She also got flown into Washington when they were putting the guidelines together for how Title IX would be implemented. They wanted input from people that were leading programs, and so she was there. And one of the reasons she could do all that we're talking about was because the president of the university backed women's sports. He had her back.
yes, Sandy Boyd. It was,
And there were so many places in the country that didn't have that. I mean,
Yeah,
some state, Iowa.
so there's sorry to go. There we go. So just leaping ahead.
Decades. Yeah. So, homegrown, I mean, both from Iowa, both coaching, experts. I mean, Glitter just retired, Jensen, her heir, they have just been phenomenal. And during the time that we were researching this book, we had a chance to hear from both of them. We heard from Jensen in a press conference in Charlotte, and it was so interesting that she and Lisa, when we talked to them, they were keen on the history. And this was when Caitlin was there. And they would speak to it. Y'all may have seen that in the national media, that they would speak to it. Well, they spoke to it about us. Not many people really did that. And one of the big reasons was Christine Grant. They had forever kept a touchstone with her. She was that longtime women's athletic director, and they knew the importance of leadership and in the people who came before. So, I mean, they're just incredible.
Yeah, and then with Caitlin, again, we had a chance to ask a couple of questions at a couple of different press conferences, and she was just so knowledgeable and so thoughtful about the history. And so you could really see that she had come up both as a great player, but as someone who really understood the game. We were always just so impressed with that, and obviously with how she was brought along by Bullard Jensen. It's just phenomenal. Which is the sense of history and the significance that goes all the way back to those early pictures. That's terrific,
right? And you know how coaches have certain goals when they run practices, and you're always trying to accomplish them. Well, and they have sessions of different types. Well, one session that Jensen and also Bluter, the run would be about my history. You know, I mean, it wasn't just a nice idea. You know, they really incorporated it into their program. Yeah.
So there it is. We're ready for questions.
All right. Well, that was very interesting. Excited to dig in a little bit deeper. So Susan, you mentioned that you're the daughter of a basketball coach yourself, but I'm curious to hear a little bit deeper what each of your relationships were with basketball. Did either of you play or come from kind of sports families, so to speak?
Yeah, yes, yeah. My exposure came first through my dad. He never pushed it, but you know, he was a coach and a physical education and health teacher, and he loved what he did. He just loved it. And I, you know, when I was very little, we just beg to go to his practices. And, you know, could I just watch, you know, that kind of thing. So, yeah, he was supportive. You know, the more I showed interest, he gave me feedback and gave me a basketball one year. I got the rim, you know, for Christmas. I got faded. I'm like, oh my God, he's got to put this thing on. Yeah. So he, you know, he was a busy man, but he is where I really got grounded in the game. And he, you know, and then I played in high school and loved it. Would like to have played more, you know, before then, but not that many opportunities. I played playground, I played with boys, I played with anybody just pick up. And so that was mine.
Well, I actually got first interested by my dad as well. My dad was 6'4", which was tall for back then. And he actually he grew up in rural Texas. And when he was a sophomore, his team won the state championship. Texas, like the 1A, the little. So I always knew about that, and was fascinated by that. But I was also interested when I was in North Carolina. Now, basketball's kind of a big deal in North Carolina. You know, you go to North Carolina, and I was working on my PhD, and I really was interested in, you know, sort of getting the pulse of the state or people, you know, going beyond the politicians and such, and really understanding some cultural issues. And basketball was a great way to do that because everybody played. I mean, people, you know, black, white, men, women, urban, rural, everywhere people had played basketball. So you could look at all of that, and sports really touched on something that I think was very important across the country, and in particular North Carolina. So that's how I got to the point where I did my dissertation, and then I thought there needed to be a women's basketball book, but I didn't want to write it. And that's how we got into all those years ago. 20 years.
Yeah.
So speaking of that first edition, I'm curious to hear about how, or if I suppose, your research process kind of differed with this updated version compared to back in 2004 or 2005, that first edition.
I think that's a really good question because things really have changed. There were two, we're talking about this before. There were two big changes, I would say. I mean, the first one was that as sport becomes a bigger deal and coaches and players are busier and you have more going on, it's a whole lot more difficult to get interviews with people than it was 20 years ago. So it was really difficult to do. We got a couple of really good ones, but people were just busy. You know, they didn't have at the same kind of time. And they had all these big publications, ESPN and all this that wanted to talk to them. So, but the sort of advantage was there was so much more written. People had put out books. There were lots more articles. So there was a lot that we could gain from reading the press and looking at interviews or looking at speeches when people are inducted into the Hall of Fame. So there were lots of other ways that we could get information. So that was, you know, helpful and not helpful.
I agree with Pamela. Those are the two big things. I agree. Nothing, not really anything else. It really was access, to people, but then this whole trove of material that you couldn't have dreamed of, 25 years ago when we were beginning work on that first edition.
What year was the first edition?
2005.
Yeah. This is the 20th anniversary edition, that's why I said we were.
Who was your first?
The new press.
Did you have trouble finding?
No, we really didn't.
No, I don't think so. Go ahead.
No, they're very interested. They have contacted me. I've done some other basketball things. They contacted me to see if I was interested in a book, and that also helped me think about, we could do one. And so that worked out actually quite well. And then the University of North Carolina Press, where I published several things, they did the paperback. They bought the paperback rights to put out paperback for the first edition. And so then when we were really thinking about a second edition, the new press wasn't particularly interested, but UNC was. So that's why we ended up publishing the second edition with UNC, which is a wonderful press. And really, really
kind of staying in that research and writing vein, there's definitely a repeating theme throughout the book of the many ways that players' personal lives and identities intersected with their basketball careers. So I'm curious what that process was like for the both of you, kind of balancing the social aspects of the history with the stats and facts, if you will, of individual players, teams, and the changing league landscape.
Well, I'd say the first challenge is what do you put in, what do you get out? Because there's so many great stories. There's so many great teams. There's so much that you can do. But we didn't want to just be a stats and facts book. I mean, it was an interpretive book. And so we had to pick each, which is the story that best tells this larger story that we want to tell. So Iowa, for example, the basketball, the high school basketball, that was an easy one. That was the way to start the high school basketball because it was so significant in Iowa. And then for like the African American women, one of the really interesting stories was Tuskegee, which had not only great women's basketball teams, but they had a great women's track team. They had some of the best track athletes in the world. And in fact, one of the people I was able to interview back then is Alice Coachman, who was the first woman of African descent to win an Olympic gold medal. She won the high jump in 1948. But she said she actually liked basketball better. So if there'd been basketball in the Olympics, she would have really liked that. And she was apparently a really good rebounder, as you can imagine, for the best high jump player in the world, or best high jumper in the world. So it's like, where do you find the story that tells what you want to say, and so you can explain to people why this or that got left out.
Yeah, I would echo what Pam's saying, and also know that we really did try to tell it through the lives of people. We wanted these stories to be people stories that hew to the themes that were germane to the eras, and so it was a struggle to know what to omit. That was hard. It really was hard. In terms of the stats and facts, we did try to get the broad contours in there and the big dates, the turning point kind of dates, critical junctures and all that. And so you'll see in the back there are some compendiums of champions. So if you do want to check years that people won, who won, we have all of that. but it really was stories and people that really fleshed out our themes.
And it did help if we could interview somebody that we get at, then you'd have a really good story that you could tell. So that also, that kind of went into who do we have the material to tell those good stories.
I think I'll maybe just ask one more before we turn it over to the audience. What are you most excited about or hope to see in women's basketball in the next, 5 or 10 years?
Well, Caitlin to get well. They're doing great as it is. That's one thing, but
Yeah, I mean, I would just say, I want things to stick, If anything, when you read our book, you'll see growth and recession, and, in broad ways. And if we can just stay in the growth and holding, and, because women still have a long way to go to get equal opportunities,
equal respect.
yeah, and the path is really emerging. I think so. That would be sort of my dream on a big level.
Yeah, just to keep going because we found whether women's sports is supported has to do a lot with broader social ideas about what women can do and what they're supposed to. The role they're supposed to play in society. So in World War II, just like with Rosie the Riveter, the women's basketball, the AAU is really strong. You get to the 50s and you get this sort of pullback to housewives and men are one thing, women are another. And then, women's basketball fades away. So you really do, so I guess our hope is that by continuing to grow, that will also mean that opportunities for women in other fields and respect for women will continue to grow, which is sadly not guaranteed. But, but keep working at it. That's the thing, women never stop working at it, and that's another thing our book shows.
So thank you. I think we're going to go ahead and turn it over to you folks in the audience, and we'll ask that you just wait to be handed a microphone so that our friends online can also hear your questions.
Sorry, I missed the very beginning of this, and you might have covered this, but for Iowa, did you talk about Denise Long? And especially, does the Ames Library have the CD of New Providence movie about Denise's life? And otherwise, I gave a copy of it to the Roland Library since that's my hometown.
Well, that's terrific. And I've seen video of her playing, but that's one of those stories that we couldn't tell, because you just can't tell all the stories. So when we got to the 60s and that era, it was more about the sliding backward and then the rise of Title IX. So it was sort of that change. So we didn't talk about the stories that kind of kept going, like Iowa continuing to have the tournament. That sort of anyway. That's how it.
Following up on that, did you name any Iowa players at that time?
From the 60s, right? You're talking about no, we don't have any. We don't have any Iowa players there. Sorry, but.
Well, I was just going to say, in general, in the book, we talked about a lot of Iowa teams, through the eras, but specifically to your point, not at that point did we talk about individual players, but we didn't talk about many, some, but lots. A lot of the times it was teams.
And then some of the players, we talked about sort of the AAU, the big AAU stars who were like All-American multiples. That's sort of how we, you have to read 6 on 6 to hear about, to read about all that. We have, of course, a distinguished author about history, specifically Iowa basketball.
One of the perennial challenges has been women being able to control, meaning being in charge. And do you see signs of progress in that area or not? I mean, I'm thinking in terms of coaches, but also administration and television and so forth. The women have always wanted to run their own sports, but it's very, very challenging. And a lot of women have worked very hard for that.
Oh, absolutely. And actually, one of the things that we look at the very end of the book that I think is really positive development, that's sort of a development out of Title IX in the 70s, is that you now have women who have made their way up the corporate ladder. At ESPN, in other places, and part of what's really important about supporting particularly a pro league is corporate support. It's not just about ticket sales. And so now you have some of these upper levels. We talked about Ally Bank, which has, their sort of sports promotional team is all women who played college sports in the early years of Title IX. And so they love sports, and now they're in a position where they can actually put those corporate dollars into supporting women's soccer, women's basketball. Actually, the times we saw Caitlin Clark and Lisa Wooder and Jen Jensen was at the Ally Tip-Off in Charlotte, where they did this big promotional, big deal beginning of the season event as a way to keep, women's basketball in spotlight. So that kind of thing, that is a change that has happened very slowly, but you see some of it.
Any other questions from our audience? Okay. Come in.
Back to Denise Long. In your book, did you show anything or tell anyone in there who had the most points ever? Like Denise had like 80 or something out of 100 points.
We talk about the total points in college. We talk about Lynette Woodard and of course Caitlin, who then sets the record. But we didn't know that was something that the most points per game. That's not something that we looked at all.
Right. It was more career based and the bigger picture. Not that it isn't important. It's just that given we're trying to tell these stories that really tell our themes, it worked against us to get too micro, so that's kind of what's going on there.
With 20 years between edition 1 and edition 2, what other themes, how did you revise it? I'm curious.
Well, it's interesting. We didn't really revise as much as we added. We added 3 chapters because so much had happened. A couple of really key things, sexuality. When we finished the book in 2005, there was still, people really still kept their sexuality under wraps to a degree. The WNBA was not interested in promoting that or pretending, they would basically, Sue Wicks saying, they want you to wear these dresses and this lipstick, and it was sad because everybody looked miserable because some of them like to dress up, but then ones but they were supposed to put on this, this facade.
Yeah, kind of a, if you work straight, you had to act straight, you had to look at whatever that is. But, there were certain conventional themes around that. And as Pam is saying, when our first edition came out, that theme of sexuality was just really, we anguished over this, about how much to talk about, how explored, unrespected, or, and all that. And we did touch on it. We talked about it. But
bit by bit through history, because obviously it's always been
we were able to really talk about a change, from that first edition in this, these 3 added chapters that we put in. Also, another theme that emerged that was really strong from the last 20 years was social activism by WNBA players. The WNBA, from 2005 till 2013, 14, they were still struggling to really get visibility. There were these top college players coming from UConn and other places, and then they would go to the WNBA and nobody would hear from them or see them. That was how low the visibility was. And the WNBA players just, of course, hated it. And they just decided, to be who they were from a sexual identity standpoint. And also, if there were issues that they felt like were important, they were going to speak out. And they did. And they really were the first, many times, of pro teams and a league to speak out about racial justice and other things, back from 2010 to 2020. And our book charts how that builds and culminates in that 2020 season and Black Lives Matter. And you can also read about how the sexuality issue builds, and you can read it through the story of Simone Augustus.
Yeah.
And the battles in our country for equal rights for LGBTQ plus, and the players and how they began to deal with it. So those were 2 of the really big themes.
Yeah, and you see that. I actually talk about the Lynx, the Minnesota Lynx, and that's the place that you really see that. The first thing is that actually Simone Augustus is one of the first players to come out, and she does it in the context of a referendum on gay marriage. This is when this becomes an issue before the Supreme Court makes its decision. All of these states were having, referendums pro or against. And so this was a point where players started to say, well, I need to, step forward and I need to, I need to talk about that. And the Lynx was also really the first major pro team to do something about police shooting of Black men. There was this moment when Alton Sterling was shot in Baton Rouge, which is where Simone was from. It was like the convenience store down from her house. And then the next day, there was, I think it was, I don't know if it was Philando Castile, but this second man was shot in Minneapolis. So they were just, just facing, it really hit home. And so they held a press conference and they wore shirts. And this was about 2 months before Colin Kaepernick knelt. So they really were sort of acknowledged as sort of the leading edge of sports doing that. And I think Sue Bird said really well a little bit later, she's like, well, we fought all of our lives, as female basketball players to be able to do what we want. So we're pretty good at fighting when we decided to do that. So those were parts of the reasons why we felt there needed to be a new edition, not just to say, oh, well, then so-and-so is the best team and then, the title, but to really show how these, how these issues have changed the game and how players have, stepped forward with these issues as well.
So was the AAU, is that what you?
Amateur Athletic Union.
Oh, that's what that is.
Yeah.
And it's still a prominent, it has all these teams that are.
Well, what happened, the Amateur Athletic Union, they sponsor all sorts of teams and they still do. It so happened that with women's basketball, they start in 1929, I think, is the first AAU basketball championship. And then they also developed a tournament that is extremely popular. And it's, again, considered the national championship for women. So you have these industrial teams play, you have these business colleges. The business colleges were basically secretary of the schools. These were, young women went to do that. An occasional college, but that's really where things were happening with women's basketball after high school. And somehow the AAU became this center where all of these great players came together. They had a men's AAU too, but the men had college, and that was kind of the pinnacle. But for women, it was the pinnacle probably, and really till women's college starts. And then once women start playing in college, then the AAU kind of falls off, and now it's mostly youth sports. You have a lot of younger AAU teams, but it's no longer the pinnacle that it was for all those years. It's so funny how things just happen, especially having a really popular tournament. Year after year after year, then people get interested. It was in St. Joseph, Missouri for a long time, the AAU tournament. So the businesses all got behind it. All these great players would come. They had all these pageants and things. They actually had, in the 50s, as part of this trying to, play and then be ladylike off, they actually had a beauty pageant for the players where they would wear their uniforms. You see them in knee pads with this a crown. And I swear they actually did do that. We got a picture of it.
Also, I think Fred.
It's like an
Yeah.
I think we've got time for one more question.
I wondered if you had a chance to think about how the changes with name, image, and likeness might be impacting the future for both women and men, or women's sports in particular. Have you thought about that?
It's one of the interesting differences between them is that men are getting a lot of money from sports, booster club, basically, just to bring them in. A lot more of the women, a lot of the women's basketball players do quite well, but it's basically through the commercial aspect. They have tons of social media followers, and then they do advertisements and promotions. They don't get paid just to go, although, Texas Tech paid $1 million for that great softball pitcher. Who took them to the finals, and they paid her another $1 million, and she's going to be back. So, occasionally, but some of these.
Some of the top, and I know of South Carolina, they do have a pot of NIL money. It's in the 7 figures. And, they have, they know how they want to dole that out, and sort of now they've got this whole other layer that's come on with the house. That's a person's name. The settlement that happened last spring, which means that the athletes at colleges get to share in the revenues being generated by the programs. And so this is a whole other layer that they're dealing with. I think in general, the schools and this would apply to the men and the women, I think, the haves are going to just have one. And the have-nots and the ones in the middle that are trying to really make it, it's just going to be a struggle unless they've got the wherewithal and the knowledge to figure out these roadmaps of money. And how are they going to get it in? And some colleges have already decided, you may have already heard this, they're treating themselves as a training ground for these bigger pots of NIL money that are sitting at other programs. They know they don't have enough, but they want some good players, and they know some aren't quite ready for that top program. So you can show your stuff at our school and then just jump. So it's just, it's quite a mess. I don't know how they're going to deal with all this and still have really interesting college sports.
And then programs where you have to save people year after year after year. Again, like TCU made it to the Elite Eight with all the players. I mean, like he gathered in the coach, gathered in almost everybody was the first or second year that had come in, and they played really well. They got field. So it's a different kind of sport. I don't think anybody knows how to sort out. I think many people are just they're not happy. I mean, it's a mess, really. There's not a lot of order to it, but nobody quite knows what direction to go because the Supreme Court is really tied most institutions' hands in terms of the limits you can put on something or this and that. It really is free for all, which is I'm glad I'm not a coach, right?
Yeah, and some are leaving because they don't really want to have all that on them. In addition to trying to have a great basketball product on the floor.
Well, we didn't get all of that transpired after we finished the book, so we saved very little for you. So you don't have to try to sort it out.
It was just picking up, and then the house settlement came, as very very recent. We actually finished last. Let me get my deadlines right.
Yeah, it's been May, June.
Yeah.
So that was
and from that point on of last year, we were proofing and updating whatever was critical. But all these big things were just they're doing like this and kind of lurching forward, and it's hard to. I mean, we acknowledge what was there.
And the challenge that with NIL, because it's so commercial, that if you're a female player and you just happen to be cute and girly, sadly, given the nature of the commercial world, you could do a lot better than someone who wasn't. I mean, that really was a draw for advertisers. I was reading this book, and this was woman writing about her own experience. She says, well, I was kind of a mid-level player, and I had my social media and on, and this was happening. And said, all of a sudden, my DMs started blowing up. I mean, I was getting all these offers, blah, blah, and she said I couldn't figure it out until I went back, and I realized that I had gone to Mexico, and I had posted a picture of myself in a bikini. And all the advertisers, she didn't even think about that. It was just, I guess she looked good in her bikini. All of these advertisers all of a sudden were anxious to have her be there. I mean, just to show you what it's still like in many places.
Please give our authors a round of applause.